In this video, we will explain why urban warfare is one of the most horrifying and deadliest forms of combat for all its participants, and most tragically for the innocent civilians caught in the crossfire. Also, we are going to tell you about stories and examples of urban battles you've never heard before. Let's begin. Throughout history, armies have often chosen the terrain where they would meet and fight, and this environment always dictated the way of warfare, requiring specific tactical adjustments. Battles in deserts, jungles, forests, open fields, or mountains were fought differently, depending on many factors. However, the environment that has been a real nightmare for military strategists and has only progressively worsened through history is urban warfare. It is so distinct from all other battlefields that it demands a special approach and tactics. The worst and most horrific battles are those that occurred in an urban environment. This concept of warfare is not entirely new and has existed since ancient times and the first cities, where brutal fights would be waged around the walls of a fortified city, and within it once the walls were breached by the enemy army. Then, the fights were brutally close, fought in narrow streets with primitive weapons. Even then, the horror of urban warfare was recognized, with everything in chaos, people disoriented, and no clear line between opposing sides. Civilians, of course, are collateral damage in this clash, having nowhere to go, trapped in chaos. Fires would easily start, adding another level of horror and destruction to the whole chaotic situation. However, as cities expanded and industrialized over time, buildings became larger and denser, with subways, tunnels, and infrastructures, and significantly more inhabitants, coupled with much more destructive weapons. This type of warfare only became worse and more brutal. Even today, as this video is being made, brutal fights are happening in many cities around the world, where the most frequent and greatest victims are innocent civilians, children, and women. Urban combat has drastically changed the rules of engagement. Fighting in city environments neutralizes traditional advantages such as tanks, heavy artillery, or air support. Small squads armed with handheld anti-tank weapons can devastate entire columns of tanks in the narrow city streets. A little-known example of this is Trpinjska Street during the war in Croatia, where, in a short span of time, an entire column of 19 tanks and armored transporters was destroyed by RPGs fired from houses and side streets, earning the street the nickname Cemetery of Tanks. During that war, it was common for tank columns to enter a city with infantry following between the tanks for protection. However, city defenders would welcome such attacks well prepared, hidden in houses and buildings along the route, letting the columns to drive deep into the city. They even set up fake trenches and bunkers to be targeted by tanks, while they were actually positioned on the opposite side, with tank cannons turned towards empty bunkers. Then, with a coordinated attack, they first destroyed the first and last tanks in the column, then proceeded to destroy or immobilize the ones trapped in between, leaving them nowhere to go. The infantry, now panicked and trapped among burning tanks without any cover, was mowed down by gunfire. It is said that the attackers suffered massive losses, and the firepower of tanks was almost unusable. Most experienced tankers refused orders to attack the city in such a manner, knowing they were heading into certain death. So tragically, it was mostly young tankers, aged between 18 to 22 years, recently mobilized and pushed into war, who got killed. Artillery and air support are often limited because the attacking side may want to avoid civilian casualties, while defenders might even use civilians as shields. This disregard can also be seen in modern combat, where little care is given to hospitals and civilians near military targets, and heavy artillery is used regardless. Even white phosphorus and chemical weapons were used in recent history, and even today, with absolutely no care for the people still living there. Additionally, it's often difficult to distinguish civilians from armed fighters like militias or gangs, and sometimes from individuals just defending their homes. Urban warfare tactics are complicated by a three-dimensional battlefield that blocks views and shots, offering hiding spots and protection for defenders. This has led to many incidents where defenders used family homes, with civilians still inside, to attack enemies. Then, when the attacking force located where the attacks were coming from, they would strike that building or house with artillery or a small group of soldiers, not knowing that civilians were still inside. One example from the Kosovo War occurred when the Yugoslav army received fire from a house in a village. After locating it, a small sabotage group was sent to destroy the position. Approaching the house, soldiers first attacked the windows and doors with bursts of gunfire. Then a series of hand grenades was thrown inside. After the explosions, they stormed in, only to find among the deceased Albanian soldiers an entire family that had died with them. Urban warfare heavily favors defenders. Using the cover and protection of buildings, thoroughly knowing and preparing the terrain, and placing ambushes and traps at key locations, defenders can completely turn the situation in their favor. This leaves attackers without the element of surprise and constantly at risk of walking into traps. For an attacking army, moving troops in small units is often the only strategy. However, this tactic isolates soldiers and blinds them to their surroundings, making it easy for defenders to spot and counter them. In World War II, about 40% of battles took place in urban areas. In some of these battles, there were literally no rules, using every available weapon without any concern for civilians, all with the goal of driving out and destroying the enemy. There are many examples of entire cities being leveled to the ground with massive bombing and shelling, paying no attention to any living being in them. But even after massive bombardments, it is very difficult to completely destroy a modern city with thousands of buildings and houses, and infantry is still the only way to fully clear the city of resistance forces. One of the key factors in urban warfare is snipers. A sniper has countless opportunities and positions from which they can operate so effectively hidden that they cause general terror in enemy ranks, inflicting huge losses. Also, it is almost impossible to identify and locate a good sniper, because after a few effective shots, they would quickly change location and continue to operate covertly. Even in the attack on a city, snipers play a crucial role. A small team of special units, for example, could cause complete chaos in the attacked city. They would choose a suitable building to occupy and settle into. Sniper teams would have their own security that would watch their backs in the building, placing mines and traps at entrances. From there, they would mostly have a good view of the city, conducting observation and reconnaissance of enemy activities and causing general chaos, making exiting from any shelter risky for the attacked side. This was, for example, the tactic of the Americans in the Battle of Fallujah, when they occupied key positions, so-called strongholds in the city, and from there, well protected, attacked the enemy. For example, in the Chechen War, this tactic was perfected because many Chechens had also served and been trained in the Russian army. During the First Chechen War, most Chechen fighters were organized into combat groups of 15 to 20 personnel, further subdivided into 3 or 4-man fire teams. Each fire team comprised an anti-tank gunner, often armed with RPG-7s or RPG-18s, a machine gunner, and a sniper, supported by ammunition runners and assistant gunners. In Grozny, to destroy Russian armored vehicles, 5 or 6 hunter-killer fire teams were deployed at various levels, on the ground, in second and third stories, and in basements. Snipers and machine gunners would pin down supporting infantry, while anti-tank gunners targeted the vulnerable parts of the vehicles like the top, rear, and sides. Initially, the Russians were caught off guard, expecting to capture the city easily. The Russians had to deploy self-propelled anti-aircraft guns to engage Chechen combat groups, as their tanks' main guns couldn't elevate or depress enough to target enemies in buildings, and an armored vehicle's machine gun was unable to suppress fire from multiple teams simultaneously. The Russians then had to increase their infantry numbers and systematically advance through the city, moving house by house and block by block, with dismounted infantry supporting the armor. Proactively, the Russians began setting up their own ambush points and moving armor towards them to lure Chechen groups into traps. When enemies finally meet in buildings, the ensuing battle is brutal, intense, and unforgiving. Combatants often find themselves not just on opposite sides of a street, but in the same building, sometimes even in the same room. One technique used in such environments is called mouse-holing. Instead of passing through exposed doors or hallways, soldiers create new passages by blasting or breaking through walls, ceilings, and floors. This method allows troops to move unpredictably and avoid booby-trapped or heavily defended doorways or streets. When it comes to clearing buildings, the procedure is methodical and violent. Soldiers typically first fire bursts from machine guns or submachine guns, followed immediately by grenades to neutralize any remaining threats before entering. Soldiers must quickly assess the environment for any remaining dangers, including hidden enemies or potential traps. Every step is calculated, with soldiers covering each other's movements, ready to respond immediately. Additionally, when they are so close to the enemy, hand-to-hand fights are common when there is a weapon malfunction or ammunition runs out. For instance, U.S. Marine Corporal Clifford Wooldridge remained behind to cover his team's withdrawal during a gun battle. Hearing voices from behind an adjacent mud wall, he rushed around the corner, coming face to face with two enemy fighters, and opened fire at point-blank range, killing both with his M249 saw. As he moved back behind the wall to reload, he spotted the barrel of an enemy machine gun poking around the corner. Without hesitating, Wooldridge dropped his empty weapon and seized the barrel of the enemy fighter's machine gun. As the two grappled in hand-to-hand combat, the Taliban fighter reached for a grenade attached to Wooldridge's flak jacket. Wooldridge then took hold of the enemy's machine gun and beat the man to death with it. There are many such examples which show us how truly devastating and horrible war is. Urban warfare reveals these harsh realities of war, marked by intense fighting and a heavy toll on human lives.